Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I hope this is working. I'm very new to Instagram, but it's great to be here. My name is Andrew Harris, and I'm a lecturer in Geography and Urban Studies at University College London. I hope you're keeping safe and well and enjoying your August, wherever you are at the moment. So it's a great privilege to be invited into the online bedroom of the Architectural Foundation. So thank you very much to Alicia Pivaro for inviting me here. So the story that I've chosen for this evening is this one, Narcopolis, which is the debut novel of Jeet Thayil from 2012. I wanted to choose a story, an actual piece of fiction, because I think that kind of works better at this time of the evening. And I think also this book works quite well because actually it's a series of kind of stories within a main story. So I've selected one chapter, chapter 6, but I think it kind of works as a sort of freestanding story in its own right. This book, I think, chimes to me for a number of reasons. I first read it, although it's been out for a while, back in March. And perhaps unsurprisingly, given nearly all its protagonists have some form of drug addiction, it's a book that has a very strange relationship with time. It creates a kind of languorous but intense world that seemed all too apt, particularly for those early months of lockdown. There's an unconventional narration. It's never clear-cut or strictly chronological. Past, present and future kind of intermingle. And indeed, as I hope I'll illustrate in this chapter I've chosen, 2020 is somehow prefigured back in 2012 when it was first published. Another important reason why I've chosen this book for you this evening is its very close relationship with Bombay, Mumbai, which is a city that I've done a fair amount of field work over the last 2 decades. It's a rich and poetic account of urban worlds that rarely feature within my field of urban studies. So it charts the kind of intimate lives of opium users, prostitutes, eunuchs, many others, across different sorts of backgrounds and across different sorts of experiences of violence, of despair, but of love and hope at the same time. And indeed, I think that the kind of Narcopolis of Bombay is in many respects the sort of main protagonist of the book. And indeed, the very first line, which I'll read: Bombay, which obliterated its own history by changing its name and surgically altering its face, is the hero or heroine of this story. And I think for me, the book actually offers some new perspectives for thinking about urban change in India and indeed beyond India, particularly by kind of using sort of drugs as a sort of centre point for thinking about the way that a city works or doesn't work. And in some ways, this book, kind of the kind of broad kind of story it tells is a kind of quite a sudden and sharp switch between a kind of post-independent India of the 1970s around opium, moving into the kind of neoliberal era of heroin and cocaine, particularly in the 1990s. So, I think quite a speculative sort of way into maybe charting a different sort of set of narratives around urban change. The book, I Am a Geographer, also I think offers important, distinct vantage points for thinking about Bombay. And although actually the chapter I'm about to read you, and I will read it soon, don't worry, actually has no reference to Bombay or India, I think. It tells the story, or the backstory of one of the characters in the book called Mr. Lee. He features earlier in the book as an opium seller with magnificent opium pipes in Bombay. He is a Chinese exile, and this chapter offers hints as to how he ended up fleeing China for India with his magnificent opium pipes. Now, I think this story helps hint at the crucial and often overlooked role for opium, actually, in shaping Bombay as a major international trading centre through the role of the British in exporting opium to the Chinese in the 19th century. But I find this chapter particularly relevant for now, for today, due to its focus on Wuhan. So the chapter 6 I'm about to read is called To Wuhan. And this is, for obvious reasons, a place that's become far more prominent as a sort of international urban centre for, as we all know, the reasons why. And actually, indeed, I was reading earlier articles about pool parties going on in Wuhan, and certainly I wasn't reading those in 2019. Now, there are several lines, particularly towards the end of this chapter, that I find really, I read them and I sort of jumped up, kind of quite startled back in March when I first read this. I think they are quite sharply prescient. And indeed, there's, further twists because Mr. Lee in the previous chapter, or was it the one before, actually discovers that his father wrote a book that was secret because it was banned, no one was allowed to read it, that was actually called Prophecy. So, I hope you're sitting comfortably. I will begin. To Wuhan. In the morning, a cadre came to his quarters with a summons to the commissariat. He thought, how did they find out? What did I do? What did I do? He dressed quickly and followed the man to a room where Commissioner Hu stood in front of a blackboard with a dozen or so others. There was a table with sweet cakes and tea and cigarette packs arranged in the shape of a pyramid. There were men who were so important that no one knew their names. They smoked and interrupted Commissioner Hu's speech with rude jokes. Commissioner, we heard you last night. The earth shook so much that we thought the building would surely fall. Later, Wai Kyo-ching also made a speech, and Li tried to pay attention, but he heard only some of the words. Blockade, and industrial production, and railway shipments, and sabotage, and military supplies. He heard the words, but he was unable to fit them together into a coherent pattern. He thought about Pang Mai, how she slept through the earthquake, how delicate her feet were, and how lucky he was. At noon, Li was told he would be going to the province capital of Wuhan, where he was to meet the regional military commander, the warlord General Lo Sai-ta, and negotiate an end to the factional fighting that had paralysed the city. Commissioner Hu told him he had an hour to pack. As he left the commissariat, he looked for Pang Mai, but she was nowhere to be seen. The trip to Wuhan took a little less than 4 hours. He was travelling with a group of Red Guards who changed seats throughout the flight. They pointed out the window and laughed. What were they laughing at? Nothing could be seen, except a grey wall of clouds and rain or condensation. He heard a high whine from the small plane's twinned engines, and he felt the vibration from the metal under his feet. When people walked up and down the aisle, the plane wobbled. At times it shook so violently that he thought he would surely fall from the sky, and he found he was gripping the armrests. There was an announcement. Passengers carrying guns, ammunition, and radioactive material were asked to hand them over to the attendants, who would return said items when the flight landed. At this, some of the Red Guards handed over an assortment of weapons, including rifles, pistols, and army issue knives. Traditional music followed. Li listened until the music faded into a hiss. He slept for a little while and was woken by another announcement. The plane was approaching Wuhan, which was a great industrial city of central China. Passengers were forbidden to take pictures from the aircraft windows or on the ground. There was a pause. Then the voice said that those who wished to alight could do so. The plane circled several times before landing. The attendants returned the Red Guards' weapons. More music was heard on the intercom. Not Chinese selections, but a song from the Western movie Mary Poppins. When Li stepped off the aircraft, he saw that the runway was in disarray. Planes and trucks were parked pell-mell, and groups of young men and women walked around issuing orders that only added to the chaos. They strolled across the tarmac as if it were a village lane, or they squatted and smoked and wrote slogans in the dirt. The sun was out, and as Li walked towards the airport building, he heard his name called by the young guards who were on the flight with him. They were gathered around a jeep that had driven right up to the plane. They waved to him, and Li walked back. The guards had convinced the driver of the jeep to take them to the city, they said, and Lee was welcome to ride with them. They all crowded into the vehicle. As it left the airport and took the road into the city, the guards decided that they wanted to eat at a restaurant. Hey, driver, said one. If you see a pig, run it over. We're hungry. The driver smiled and said nothing. The guards seemed to Lee like teenagers. They were obnoxious and without shame. They were never silent. At the restaurant, they ordered char siu fan and beer, and when it was time to pay, they told the proprietor that they had no money. Lee had cash, but the younger men wouldn't let him take out his purse. No, you're our guest. Do you want us to lose face? They turned to the proprietor. We invite you to Peking, they told him. Come to Peking, so we can exchange revolutionary ideas. You will be our guest. The man knew better than to argue. From his hotel that night, Lee made a phone call, but the operator said she was not in her room. He tried the number at hourly intervals and gave up around dawn. The next morning, he was late for his meeting with the man Commissioner Hu had described as a warlord. General Lo Sat-tai got up when Lee was shown in, but instead of making him feel welcome, the general picked up his cigarettes, excused himself and left the room. Sometime later, an assistant appeared to tell Lee that the general would not be available until later in the day. There was a crisis at the railway terminus that required his presence. Lee left the compound and walked to the end of the street and turned right as if he knew where he was going. There were no buses or taxis, but the street was full of people. Uncleared garbage and old newspapers lay on the corner. He kept walking and came to a bridge, the famous bridge known throughout the country as a marvel of modern engineering. At its base, a man was cooking rice for his family. There were people swimming in the river and clothes spread out to dry on the parapets. Lee walked past a lecture group of some sort, a class of 5 or 6 who sat in a circle and listened to a woman reciting something. Was it a poetry or the words of a song? He caught a few lines. The world is on fire. Time is a bomb. 10,000 years are not enough when so much remains to be done. Now he could see the entire span of the bridge. He noticed that there were small groups of people sitting throughout the length of it and some kind of obstruction at the other end. He stopped, and when he saw what it was, stopped, turned round and went back the way he came. A bus had been parked crossways, and on the far side of the bus was a snaking line of cars and trucks and military transport vehicles, a line that stretched further than he could see. The drivers had disappeared and the vehicles looked like they hadn't moved in a long time. Below him, the muddy Yangtze too was immobile, as if it had turned to cement. It was night when he returned to the general's office. Lo Sa-tai was on the couch, a Panama hat worn low over his closed eyes, and a cigarette burning in his hand. He wore a white shirt and linen trousers to go with the hat, but the overall effect of the ensemble wasn't elegance as much as exhaustion. He seemed too tired to speak. There were 2 other men in the room who greeted Lee as if they knew him well. One, an officer who gave his name only as Tung, took him to a table where a bottle and glasses had been arranged. Lee poured himself a brandy and soda. He took a quick swallow of the drink and carried his glass and stood at the window. Sit here, said Tung, and Lee took a seat on the couch opposite the general. He noticed that General Lo's eyes had followed his progress from the window to the couch, but otherwise the general was inert, like a convalescent. Lee placed his drink on the floor and waited with his elbows on his knees. After a time, the general lifted his arm and took a slow sip of his cigarette. Tung and his colleague were having a whispered conversation. Lee couldn't hear Tung, but the other man's one-word responses were clear enough. Kalu, he said, whenever Tung stopped for breath. Eventually, Tung turned to Lee. Wuhan is a test case, he said. Everything happens here. The plague, riots, surplus productivity, famine, industrial output, the end of everything. We believe Peking is using us as a kind of social experiment. They want us to see how much punishment a city can take before it shuts down. They've posed an interesting question or set of questions. I will say that much. For example, how much chaos can the human system absorb? What are the uses of insanity? Is there intelligence in negativity? How far can destruction extend before it stops being creative? How useful is chance? Can the individual imagination apprehend the last beach, the last bird song, the last sunset in the sky? The inhabitants of Wuhan have thought about all those questions. We've thought about them and discussed them in great detail. We've answered them too, if only to our satisfaction. There's only one question we are incapable of answering. Do you know what that is? Li thought. Why do you continue to stay here? But he shook his head. No, he said. Tong said, what are you doing here? At this, all three men looked at Li as if he had just then appeared out of thin air. I've been sent by the party to look carefully at what is happening in Wuhan, said Li. I'm expected to make a report, and that's as far as my responsibility goes. Tung was shaking his head, even before Li finished. No, he said. No, no, no. It was then that Li chose to make a comment about the Mao Zedong thought million fighting Wuhan Revolutionary Heroic Workers Troops, a coalition the general was known to support, although not openly. The Workers' Troops was larger than its older rival, the Wuhan Area Proletarian Mao Zedong Thought Fighting Workers' Center, which had the support of Peking. Li said he thought that the Workers' Troops was the cause of much of the rioting and disorder in the streets. Tung made a spitting sound. You are ignorant, he said. It is the Workers' Center that has caused unrest in Wuhan. Li nodded slowly. Then he said, there's talk in Peking that the Workers' Troops should be disbanded. At this, the general got to his feet and gestured that Li should do the same. This meeting is at an end, he said. It was the first time he'd spoken in Li's presence, and it served as a kind of signal to Tung, who threw his cigarette to the floor and shouted a slogan against the Workers' Center. Li wasn't sure what he was shouting because Tung was too angry to articulate his words properly. He marched around the room and stopped in front of Li. I am prepared to sacrifice my life, Tung said. We are soldiers. This is what we have trained for. Self-sacrifice. You tell them that. Then he walked out and let the door bang behind him. So thank you very much indeed for listening, and sweet dreams.